Welcome back to another episode of Turn 1 Podcast. We're your hosts, Jeremiah
and Thomas.
And we are going to cover the 2024 Canadian Grand Prix.
We had a day in the rain, not only once in the rain, but twice in the rain.
Yeah, the entire weekend was just complete havoc as it rained the whole weekend. Maybe not always while they're on track, but the track is soaked.
I saw where the organizer of the event and the stewards basically for the race had to apologize to the Formula One teams because everything got flooded. All the hospitality areas were flooded. And, you know, the hospitality areas are where, like, the F1 teams are making their monies with their sponsors. Like, Red Bull's got Oracle set up in a tent. You know, McLaren's got Google over there set up in a tent. So everything was flooded out. We'll talk about this grid in a minute. Quick side note, though, about these rain races. I love when you start a race in the rain because you get the chaos of turn one. You get drivers on different compounds sometimes. But then I really love something that I don't think we'd seen in this race, where right when you get to the pit window for what would be a wet to dry race, it rains again.
Yeah. It's like, okay, we're starting to notice that this person in the back of the grid switched to the slicks and they're starting to activate. We have rain in 15 minutes. It's going to be in about 5 laps. Oh, no.
We're going to skip out. Well, do you want to cover anything with quali or practice?
The only thing that I want to cover in quali and practice is that people were slipping and sliding. I mean, practice 1 started off with Zhou Guan Yu slapping the wall, but even practice 2, whenever everything was up and running, again, everybody's just slipping and sliding all over the place. Qualifying was just a slip and slide. I mean, qualifying was fine. You know, they were on slicks. They were running good times. But the rest of it was just utter chaos.
He had Logan Sargent make it out of Q1 for the first time this year.
Look at that. Both Ferraris didn't make it to Q3.
And he had a really good race, didn't he? Logan Sargent.
We'll get into that.
No, so let's move into the grid for the race because there is a ton to cover for the Canadian Grand Prix. Your biggest calls, I'll start from the back of the grid and work my way up. Sergio Perez, Checo starts down in the 16th place, which he didn't improve on really throughout the race day, so we won't actually talk about him that much other than maybe a little incident he had here or there. Both Ferraris, 11 and 12, locking out that row out of the top 10.
That's ridiculous. I mean, especially we just had Charles Leclerc win the Monaco Grand Prix, and Carlos Sainz was not far behind him in that race. And then immediately the very next race, didn't even make it into Q3. Is wild.
I almost want to label this video that we're doing right now as like Formula One is back. Because it doesn't matter. We've gone over 4 race weekends now, not knowing what's going to happen with the top teams. Yeah. We no longer know if Red Bull's going to win every race. We don't know if McLaren and Ferrari are going to be competitive week in and week out. This race, where did George Russell come from in the pace? I mean,
but Mercedes in general, they brought upgrades
seriously
to the car, and it just made the worlds of difference.
And even Fernando Alonso in the Aston was competitive.
Yeah, and Lance Stroll was highly competitive.
Going back to this list of the qualifying order, both RBs in the top 10. Yeah. We know that they were kind of at the top of the midfield level, but we didn't know that they were both top 10 level.
Not only top 10, we didn't know that one of them was top 5 level.
Yeah,
Daniel Ricciardo sneaks into that 5th spot.
And then you have the McLarens locking out the second row of the grid, 3 and 4, which kind of par for the course the past couple of weeks. But again, you never know if they're going to be like pole sitters or if they're going to be just one step below. And then Max Verstappen in the 2 spot because George Russell takes his second pole in Formula One.
Which, by the way, I don't know if you know what those times were. Is a very big deal. So get this.
Okay.
It's only happened one other time in the history of Formula One. George Russell, not his final lap, but the lap before in Q3, sets a 1:12.000.
Yeah.
Max Verstappen in his final push lap sets a 1:12.000 on the dot. Now it gets crazier because if you look at Q2, George Russell actually hit a 1:11.7, so they were much faster. And Max even came on record and was saying that, you know, he was happy that he tied George and got second because after what he saw Mercedes do in Q2, he was nervous because he knew that they weren't going to be able to do that. And so for Q3 to come out and they hit the exact same time to the 1,000th of a second.
So if you don't, I mean, I'm sure if you're watching this, you probably understand why, but maybe if you come from no racing background or maybe a different kind of motorsports. First off, we really like using the motorsport.com, results page. I think it's laid out pretty clear. But like Jeremiah said, if you pull up the grid layout for Canada, George Russell, 12.000, Max, 12.000. But then you look over at their average speed across the course of a lap, which is also identical because their time is identical. 218.050 kilometers per hour on average throughout the lap.
Jeez.
The craziest thing about that is you have two drivers with two incredibly different racing styles, two incredibly different racing pedigrees, maybe. I don't know what you want to call it. Max, the 3-time, about to be 4-time world champion. George Russell still fighting to get some wins. Two incredibly
different cars.
That's the other thing. Formula One is half driver skill, maybe not even half, maybe like 30% driver skill, and then the rest of it is car build, which is made by two completely different teams, two completely different everything, just following a basic set of regulations, but with a lot of creativity and wiggle room within those. And you have them go out on the track at basically the same time and do the exact same thing.
That's ridiculous.
That's crazy.
It really is. And the craziest part is Lando Norris almost made this a 3-way for that .000 because he came at 21 thousandths of a second behind Max Verstappen and George Russell.
His average speed was 217.986 compared to their 218.050. I mean, you can't. That's faster than like a human eye can blink. Like that's crazy.
It's wild.
But that's the difference between first, second, and third. And George gets it because he did it first, right? That's the explanation.
Right.
The least amount of laps that gets that time gets that done. Let's move on over into the race. That was all that we had for the grid. You want to take us through turn 1 and turn 2?
Yeah, I'm going to combine turns 1 and 2 because, first of all, it's just a complete spray mess where you can hardly see anything. So if there is something I missed, I apologize. Couldn't see anything.
You couldn't pay me to be out there in the grid in that condition with these guys coming around you.
You couldn't see anybody. You couldn't see anything. And me trying to break it down on camera where I can slow it down, I'm like, is that Tsunoda? No, that's Stroll. I mean, you can't hardly see anything. But here's what I was able to gather.
Okay.
So the top 4 are going to get away completely fine. They fall in line, nothing happens there. Then immediately stuff starts to go down as Ricciardo loses positions to Alonso and then Hamilton going into turn 2. We see Stroll passing Tsunoda. We see Leclerc passing Albon and Tsunoda. Tsunoda had a bad go at it, if that's the start. I mean, let's be honest.
The RB was out of order.
We saw Ricciardo and Tsunoda immediately drop back. Yep. So you have Magnussen, who, by the way, we didn't even mention this. Haas started on the wets. They're the only team that started on the wets. Everybody else started on the intermediates.
We're going to talk a lot of Haas today, too.
So you have Kevin Magnussen immediately getting around Sargent, and then with Sainz going wide after being pushed by Albon, he gets past Sainz as well. So that's 2 spots for Magnussen. Further down the grid, we see a whole mix-up as Gasly is going around. They get around turn 1, everything's fine, but as they're going into turn 2, in an effort to not hit Sargent, he whips it to the right. Unfortunately, Perez is sitting there, which it's always Perez, isn't it? I hate to say that, but lately it's always Perez. But it wasn't
his fault.
No, it wasn't. You're right. But I'm saying he's always just there.
Just anytime there's an accident.
And if he's not in the top 5, he's just there for any kind of accident that happens.
But that was Gasly avoiding Sargent, then hitting Perez.
Right. So Gasly comes over to the right to avoid Sargent, goes right into Perez, which causes Gasly to go sideways. And Perez at this point is just nose into the side of the side pod of Gasly. And then Gasly's able to straighten out. But because of this, Hulkenberg's able to slide by and Ocon is able to slide by. And now you have Perez and Gasly immediately losing 2 spots off the jump.
Yeah. And I think you mentioned it, but like off the jump, it was crazy because you had all the spray, of course, but the top 4 went in line with each other. You had Russell, Verstappen, and the McLarens, but then everybody else behind that was wheel to wheel going through turns 1 and 2.
Everybody.
And so, of course, you're gonna have some contact somewhere. It's gonna happen. But you also had a lot of people going inside across the grass because they didn't want to get hit. You had a lot of people running wide outside because they were slipping and sliding. It was fantastic. I started to keep note throughout lap 1 of like who went off track and who was sliding. It was everybody, so I stopped taking notes. Like I had Carlos going off, I had Leclerc going off, but everybody did it. And then ending lap 1, kind of around where that hairpin is before you get to the big straight, every driver, as they're coming out of the apex of the hairpin and applying throttle and throttling out of the turn, slid their back end around.
Yeah,
every single
I noticed
one
that.
of them.
I was sitting there with my brother on the couch, and every time they would show a replay of it, I'd be there, do 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 do, which is the theme song to Tokyo Drift. It's hilarious.
In lap 2, so you mentioned Haas leaping up a couple of spots. Lap 2, Magnussen was up to 5th place, meaning he had gained 9 spots in the course of about a lap and a half. Hulk made it up to was up 8 places into 9th place.
Magnussen got up to 4th, didn't he?
He did eventually, but this was lap 2. So I was kind of looking at their 1 lap run rate for this.
Okay.
Because he got a lot of people on the straight, too. When they got to the straight, he went wide open and flew past.
Well, I mean,
some
everybody
people.
coming out of the exit of the previous turn was just couldn't get on the throttle. Meanwhile, Magnussen's able to put the foot down and take off.
Yeah, and then you even had Daniel Rick. He was down to 8th, I think, at that point, which you touched on. Okay, let's get into some of these battles. We'll cover battles and key moments and strategies, all that good stuff, and we'll end with some radio calls, which were less funny and more just Charles Leclerc panicking this week. But we'll get to it. First battle we've got to talk about is that battle we were just talking about, Haas versus the world, the first 5 to 6 laps of the race.
Man.
They were the only team on wets.
As a secret Haas fan, I have to say that because they've been terrible for the entirety of existing. But
he sits at home wearing his little Haas PJs.
And then out in public, I just throw it over to the side.
I'm a Mercedes fan.
Yeah. So, in watching this race, being able to watch Haas just climb all the way up to the top of the grid as both Haas's end up in the points way up there. For the first 5 laps, it was exciting. After 5 laps, you started to see a line form where the inters were able to stick to that line, and it was way less water. They were able to get way more speed, and you started to see the Haas guys moving over towards offline, trying to find the wet spots, trying to find the places where the water was puddling. That way they could keep the wets fired up. But ultimately, after about 5 laps, you start to see them fade away, and this broke my heart completely as they then proceed to leave Magnussen out there for 7 more laps?
So he pit on lap 8, I want to say.
So they left him out there for 3 laps.
So on lap 5, the lap 5 was the key here. So Magnussen had made it up to 5th, maybe 4th by that point, lap 5. And he was running faster laps than pretty much everybody on the grid.
Yeah.
Until lap 5 is when the top 3 runners, which were your Verstappen, your Russell, and your Norris, ran faster. And Hamilton behind was running faster. And so lap 5 was the key point where Haas should have made the switch over and said, all right, lap 6, pit, let's get you on some inters and get you back rolling with the group. You made a ton of moves. You know, there's other people that are struggling and way behind. You'll come out ahead of where you would have been otherwise. But no, they leave him out there for 3 extra laps.
And then when he does pit,
it takes a while.
Nobody had the tires ready.
Yeah.
So he's sitting there stationary for 8 seconds.
8.6.
Which, if you know anything about Formula One, you know that's a death sentence. Because
that's a 4x, a regular pit stop, pretty much.
Yeah, typically, I mean, we saw it later on because then Hulkenberg finally pits and they get him out there in 2.8 seconds of stationary time. Meanwhile, Magnussen's sitting there for 8 seconds. It's ridiculous.
They think, let us know in the comments if you know the definitive answer. They think that he might have been the one to call that pit stop. So, like, as he's coming in, basically, hey, I'm coming in. These tires aren't working anymore. And so they scrambled to get the tires ready.
In which case, why didn't Haas make that call way sooner?
Because it's Haas.
I mean, we saw what they did to Hulkenberg, which I believe you have the stats on.
So they left Hulkenberg. So again, lap 5 is where Haas loses the advantage. Lap 5. And again, if you're really going to take advantage of this, you switch as soon as the advantage is gone.
Yeah.
Lap 13 is when they pit Hulk. After he drops like 6 spots.
So he stays out there for 8 extra laps.
On full wets while it's not raining anymore. So not only could you have started the race on inters, because most of the team, every other team but Haas started on inters, you left him out there for 8 perfectly dry laps.
The worst part about that is by the time he finally pits, you just see this long train behind him as every single car from, where did he end up? 7th, right?
Where did he start?
The highest he got?
It was like 8 or 9th. I don't think it was 7th. It might have been 7th.
Okay, so regardless, every single car behind him, all the way down to 20th, is just stuck behind him. All of the cars within a second of each other because they're all stuck behind Hulkenberg. So when he pits, immediately you're going to lose every single position, and he did.
You were the backup, so he came out in 19th. is where he came out.
Jeez.
Lost like 12 spots.
The craziest part is that Bottas and Joe started from the pits.
Yeah.
So even they were able to catch up to the grid.
And we won't even cover this, but Joe had another disaster pit stop, which Stake's reputation continues.
I don't know if I saw that one.
It was like 12 seconds.
Oh my god.
Or something like that. Okay, so that was Haas's day. They again, the strategy would have worked really well had they pit both drivers around lap 6, maybe even lap 7. They wait a little bit too long, and it ends up dropping both drivers down, hurting Magnussen mainly because of the stop time. If he had a regular stop, it would have been a less of a hindrance.
If he
but
dropped
Hulk,
down
they
to what?
killed.
He dropped down to 13th?
When
he came out,
yeah,
I think he started the race in 14th, and then I think when he got out of the pits, he was out in 13th.
He came back out in 14th, actually.
In 14th,
Yes.
so right back where he started?
Yep.
Okay, so if that's the case, I was looking at the timing chart with this to see how close he was to the car in front of him and how close the car in front of him was close to the car in front of them. And I took away Magnussen. I took 6 seconds off of Magnussen's time. Say he got a 2.6. And, you could be more generous and say he got like a 2.8 or a 3. So if you look at the timing chart and you subtract that time he was stationary from the timing chart, he really would have been 4 places higher, 5 places higher.
It probably would have been a top 10 spot, a point spot, but they blew it. Okay, let's look at some other battles. This one didn't have too much impact on the race itself, but this happens every other race or so where you have Alonso versus Hamilton. And
champion on
champion, the old dudes, just going after it.
Battling since 07.
And they were doing it between laps 7 and 10. You had Hamilton chasing down Alonso, I want to say. And then laps 23 to 25, it was the other way around. The race ends, of course, with Hamilton 2 spots ahead of Alonso, where Hamilton was 4th and Alonso was 6th. But both of those guys still have it. They just don't have the cars.
I agreed completely.
And that it says a lot about all these guys. Like, even looking at the Haas team, they're all really good drivers. Because you give the Haas team the advantage in the car on the wets, they immediately work their way up the entire field.
Magnussen passes 10 people on his way up to the top.
In a lap and a half. Like, they can all do it. We see that. But I just love watching Hamilton and Alonso go after it.
Alonso is a master at defending in a slower car, because we know the Mercedes brought the upgrades and they were super fast, but you would see Alonso parking it right in the middle to where it didn't matter if Hamilton went wide or if he went on the inside. There was no room for him to make a move.
Or if you have the wet race, you're, depending on what tire compound you're running, you're either looking for a wet patch or you're looking for a dry patch. And so if you can do that and make the guy go to the non-preferred line, it works out. Bigger race throughout the day, of course, was Lando Norris and Max Verstappen, a race which we're getting a little more accustomed to seeing the past couple of weeks. But you have the battle really heated up on lap 19. So we mentioned this at the start, but the race started in the rain with a drizzle, and the track was already wet from the weekend long of rain that you had. But it died off around lap 4 or 5, and then it was maybe a slight drizzle, and the track was just wet. But lap 19 is when everything kind of clears up and they turn on DRS. If you remember, lap 18 is where Max ran off track a little bit and lost about 3 seconds to George Russell.
Yeah.
And also put himself within 1 second of Norris behind him.
Right.
And then the lap after that, they turn on DRS.
Yeah.
So it was completely to Max's kind of, not his downfall, but just his obstacle that they put in front of him. Because Norris heated up after that. He immediately passes Verstappen on that lap that he gets DRS. And then the very next lap, in the same place, the turn right before the wall of champions, he gets George Russell, who George Russell runs off the track because he gets under pressure.
And then at that point, that's when we start to see the pits, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, so then you get into this weird gray area. So strategy played a huge part in Canada. Lap 20-ish through 28 was like your pit window.
I want to see the first was Gasly to go to the hards.
It might have been. The only thing I took out of that was I think Hamilton was the first one to go to. No, that was later in the race. That was after the second rain. Yeah, maybe it was Gasly then.
I want to say Gasly was the first to go to the hards or the slicks in general after everybody was on the inners.
Yeah, because everybody was like, oh, they're going to be watching this Alpine to see how he does.
Or technically, if you want to be serious, it was Leclerc first.
Well, so like lap 20 to 28 was your pit window, but the interesting part about this was you had everything dry by lap 20, but rain was predicted by a couple teams between like 28 and 30. Lap 28 and 30 was when rain was predicted. So what do? Do you pit for a couple of laps on slicks only to pit again? Do you stay on what you're running the inters? Do you pit for more inters? Like, what do you do? So all of that ends up not really mattering because Logan Sargent crashes on lap 25 and puts it into a wall, and they call a safety car. We'll get to that in 1 second. Going back to the battles, I have 2 or 3 more that I want to touch on. This wasn't really a battle, more so possibly overtake of the year candidate.
Yes.
Alex Albon, can you describe that one?
The problem is, I don't remember. Was it Ocon in front of him, and
it
then
was Ricciardo in front of him, and then Ocon
behind him?
No, both were ahead, weren't they?
Well, who was the one furthest in front?
Ocon,
that's right.
Yeah.
So Ocon was the front runner in this. So Albon's in the back. I don't remember which turn it is that they're going into, but you see Ocon and Ricciardo get on the brakes. Albon gets late on the brakes, goes down the straight. He's able to get past Ricciardo, and then as they go into the braking zone, you see Ocon in front get on the brakes, and Albon fits the gap between Ricciardo right before he's about to brake and Ocon as he's just starting his brake, and very narrowly misses both cars right through the middle, swings to the inside, and then immediately gets on the brakes.
Yeah, it was the chicane at the Wall of Champions.
It was the Wall of Champions?
Because they were coming out of the straight area into that chicane.
Yeah, so passes Ricciardo on the straight,
Yep.
and then as Ocon's braking for the chicane right before the Wall of Champions,
I mean, millimeters of...
swings from the outside through both of them, threading the needle, goes to the inside, slams on the brakes, goes through the chicane, and then gets right back on the gas for the final straight, going back to the start-finish ahead of both of them.
Shows what the guy can do. I mean...
It was ridiculous.
And usually when we see Albon try to make a move like that, he crashes out. And that's why he has a kind of a history of DNFing in clutch moments. But he didn't that time, and he made it look awesome. Moving on, Norris versus Russell. So Norris, Verstappen, and Russell kind of battled throughout the day as they were the top 3 runners for the majority of the race. But this was key because Norris came out. We'll talk about his strategy in a minute. But this is when Norris is coming out of the pit for the second safety car. So this is lap 48. And he comes out ahead of Verstappen, but immediately gets passed by Verstappen and then gets passed by Russell. But he puts Russell under pressure. And again, for the second time today, Russell runs wide under pressure, hits a hairpin or hits a curb, and then flies off the track.
That wasn't after a safety car.
Yeah, it was.
No. So you're talking about when they were coming out on slicks. Norris had just ran an extra lap on his inners.
Yeah.
Yeah, that wasn't after a safety car. What happened was that the time differential, they were starting to notice the cars in the back of the grid.
Oh, that's right. That was before the second safety car.
Right.
Yeah.
So the cars in the back of the grid were starting to see a lot of progress with the slicks, and they were starting to think that, okay, this is going to be the switchover point, in which case Max and George dove into the pits, and Lando decides, I'm staying out, takes the lead, goes and sets the fastest lap, which granted, right there is when he should have pit. But no, stays out again, finishes that lap, gets the fastest lap, goes around again. And at this point, about halfway through the track, or halfway through this lap, he's starting to lose pace to the slicks because they're starting to fire up for Max and for George. And so at this point, you start to see his time difference start to go down and down and down until he finally makes his way back to the pits and goes into the pits. When he comes out on the slicks, I mean, Max is coming down the final straight, and then, of course, as you're going through 1 and 2, you have this long, winding curve that allows the pit exit, which is just a straight shot, to try and get the advantage. And so you see Lando getting on the gas as he's getting finally out of the pit speed limiter area and going through the pit straight, and then you see Max rounding that corner. Lando just narrowly gets in front of him, tries to step on the gas, gets a little low, and then Max, of course, takes that because his tires are already fired up, and he takes off. Now Lando's left to chase. But, man, I thought Lando was going to get him right there, and then it was so exciting.
And that was, good correction, because I'm so confused with the pit stops now with all the safety cars. This was the one that Lewis triggered by going in from 4th place to switch from inters to slicks, to which Max and Russell stayed out 1 extra lap because Lewis was behind them. Then they switched, but then Lando went around again.
Yeah.
But that's when he got the fastest lap.
Yes.
Also, so that was wild.
It's confusing.
Lando is having a year, though.
Absolutely.
This is the year of Lando.
The thing that bothered me is earlier, if we want to backtrack a little bit, Lando got the lead while they were still on the inters, they were cooking. This was the Logan Sargent crash.
Right. Lap
So
25.
this is when they still had the inters on. So Lando had super speed on those inters. They were all firing on all cylinders, and I don't know if Max's maybe were deteriorated from fighting with George, but Lando flew past, got the lead, and then cue the safety car. And I don't know if Lando was already past the pit entrance when this safety car came out or what the deal was, but we see Max and George dive into the pits for fresh inters. Lando stays out, stuck behind the safety car for an entire lap as he then goes into the pits. And because of that, since he didn't go into the pits ahead of Max and George got those positions back on Lando. And this frustrated me because Lando got that spot. He had the faster car. He had faster laps than both Max and George. But because he, I guess, didn't enter the pits before the safety car, or maybe the safety car got activated after he was already past the pit entrance, he was stuck behind the safety car going safety car speed, while Max and George come out on fresh inners and they're catching up to the safety car. They're allowed to go as long as they're under delta, they're allowed to go way faster than being stuck behind the safety car, and Lando ends up losing that spot.
Yeah, that was odd from McLaren, who we've seen McLaren be pretty perfect this year, and that was a slip up. All right, so last one that I have is Russell and Piastri, and the only reason I call this out, it wasn't really a long-winded battle or anything, but I have Russell in 3 different battles today, essentially losing all 3. Now, he still finished in 3rd, which is fine, right? But if you're the pole sitter, you've got to win some of your battles, dude. Both times he fought Lando Norris, he went off track. And then he tries to fight Piastri, makes contact, I think, and goes off track again and has to back out of it.
Yeah, so that was the chicane right before the Wall of Champions.
Yeah.
They're coming down the final, the long straight, and then going into the chicane, George gives Piastri no room, forces Piastri way up onto the curb, which I'm going to say right there, Piastri damaged his car.
Yeah,
because
so.
Then as George takes that position, Piastri starts falling back. Piastri loses that position to Lewis. And then I want to say at that point, George is battling Lando, or maybe he's not, but he goes off at some point. Or no, I think he pits again. And when he pits, he comes in behind Lewis. I don't remember what the circumstance was. Maybe he did run off and Lewis took that spot. But anyway, George ends up behind Lewis Hamilton. And I'm screaming at this time, "Go, Lewis! Go!" Because I wanted it so bad. And
top 3.
Then we see the battle of Mercedes.
Yep.
Because I believe that's when the race engineer said, keep in mind, this is a race, but be cautious or something like that.
Always be careful. Like, don't risk it,
Right,
basically.
because you don't want to take out both of your cars. But anyway, free to battle. So George and Lewis are going at it. George, who's on the mediums, and Lewis Hamilton, who's still on the hards, because this is before he pit for the mediums. And so you see George taking that spot, and Lewis, unfortunately, not able to get anything done there. But man, was I screaming behind the TV.
Yeah, I just think if you're George, again, you're sitting on pole, like, yeah, you're going to be under pressure all day, but, like, stop going off track. Defend a little bit. It's
hard to say on a wet track, but I know. But yes.
Defend a little bit. If you win 1 out of 3, great, but don't lose all 3. All right, so there was your battles. Key moments, I won't spend too long here, but, of course, the rain, I think that just played. That was the story of the weekend.
Oh,
you know, the 2 different rain incidents causing 2 different safety cars, and then the DRS. I think DRS was underrated this weekend. I didn't hear a lot of people talking about it, but when it was triggered versus not triggered, that's what led to all the overtakes, was that DRS being on versus off.
On the long straight
on
before
that long
the final
straight,
chicane.
yeah. That led to half of the overtakes or so. And then, of course, you had the 2 safety cars, which we talked about a little bit, but Logan Sargent on lap 25 he locks up, runs off the track, and then had to come back on, right?
That was when he was able to still save it. There was no safety car triggered for that.
The second one was when he crashed.
He actually crashed,
crashed. And then the second one was Alex Albon, who got hit by Carlos Sainz.
Yes.
So Carlos... So if you're watching the race in real time, they throw up the yellow flag or whatever on the screen, like, oh, where is it? And they switch to where Carlos is on the track. And Carlos is like essentially doing donuts in the grass.
In the grass, yeah.
Because he's trying to get out. So he's trying to get some traction. And then you see Albon's car sitting over by the wall. And it doesn't really look broken, but when you watch his onboard, his front right wheel broke off. So he couldn't, even though his car really didn't get hit that hard. Carlos is coming up to a turn, loses his back end, spins around, and as he's spinning around and kind of reversing back on the track, but not really reversing, like it's the car's momentum, pops Albon, takes Albon out of the race, and Carlos is able to get it back. That's always sad.
Yeah.
When you're collateral damage.
Yeah, I mean, he's literally just a bystander at that point. We saw
He's
Sergio completely lose it in one of the corners, end up backwards, and slap his rear wing on a wall, then crawl back to the pits, which, by the way, as I'm looking at, I'm like, hey, what happened to his rear wing? Then they go and take it back to the replay, and you see him flying backwards into the wall and just crushing all of this expensive carbon fiber. Perez has done so much damage to that car this year, it's ridiculous. Monaco, he completely destroys the car, and then the team does everything they can to get it rebuilt from Montreal, which kudos to them, for him to then slam the back into it. Thank goodness they just gave him a new contract for 2 more years.
I'm not getting into this like we did last week. One of the funniest lines of the weekend was Crofty when they showed Checo's car with the broken wing. He goes, I don't think that's the Adrian Newey design. As it's like falling apart on the ground. All right, so last thing here. We've talked on this already, but obviously key strategy moments. Haas, they kind of blew it. I think Haas had a good strategy coming into the race, being different.
It could have been
they
so
blew
great.
McLaren keeping Norris out for not 1 extra lap like everybody else, but 2 extra laps after the Hamilton pit was rough. And then I thought Lewis actually being the first to go to slicks on lap 44 kind of set him up to get the 4th place that he got. I think that worked out really well for them.
Gasly was already out. I swear Gasly was the first one.
That was early. That was earlier. We're mixed up because there's like 4 different
I see what you're saying.
Moments here. But
another point that we didn't even touch on, how about Yuki Tsunoda sliding into the grass, ending up backwards on the track, and then by the smallest margin I've ever seen in my life, Nico Hulkenberg narrowly avoids Yuki Tsunoda in what could have been a terrible collision.
You can't even see a gap between the cars, but yet Hulkenberg goes... I mean, I don't think there's contact.
I don't think so. Maybe Tsunoda's wing was under Hulk's wing and it just grazed over the top.
Grazing is the only thing I think, but Yuki's car really didn't move, but
there was no sparks, nothing.
The only thing that worked in Hulk's favor there is that you're coming down a long straight, so it's not a blind turn. He could see Yuki go off in the runoff area, and he could tell that he's out of control. And if he's coming back on track, I got to deal with that. Hulkenberg just happened to turn left in just enough time.
Man, when I went back and I watched that, I was flabbergasted. I mean, I've never seen the potential for... I mean, even Hulkenberg was talking about it afterwards where he said, honestly, I was bracing for impact.
You know what it reminded me of? Was it Monza or Suzuka where Pierre Gasly was coming out on the track and there was that tractor out there?
Oh, in the rain.
It reminded me of that.
Where they couldn't see anything.
Yeah.
Ooh, yeah.
That could have been a disaster. Okay, last thing let me cover this. So your race ends, Max Verstappen wins, but it was not an easy victory, between the quali and the wet race. And really, I think, I'm not going to say McLaren Strategy took the race from them, but it didn't help. That's for sure. So you have Lando finish in second. George Russell does come in third, which, I guess that's not the end of the world. You lost your pole to Verstappen, the champion, and Norris, who's been hot the past 5 weeks.
But you didn't lose out to Ferrari.
You didn't lose to Ferrari, and you didn't lose to your own teammate Lewis Hamilton, who came in fourth. Oscar Piastri does come in fifth. I think you're right. He did get damage from that collision with George earlier on. You have Alonso down in sixth, followed by Lance Stroll getting seventh. I didn't put a lot into Lance Stroll's weekend.
I told you, he had a great weekend.
And then, let's see, Daniel Ricciardo in eighth, Pierre Gasly ninth, and Esteban Ocon 10th.
Double points for Alpine.
Yeah, I think because 6 people were out of the race. Don't you think?
Yeah, which, by the way, we should cover how many people or all the people that ended up out of this race.
So DNFing, you had Carlos Sainz, Alex Albon, Checo Perez, Charles Leclerc, and Logan Sargent.
Yes, you heard right. Both Ferraris out of the Canadian Grand Prix.
Charles was an engine issue mainly, and Carlos was his
mishap
on whatever lap that was with Albon. So,
yeah.
Okay, last thing. I got some funny radio calls, and again, these are mostly Charles getting upset. So on lap 5, Charles comes on the radio and goes, "Hey, is everything okay with the engine?" And his engineer just says, "No, but keep pushing." Like, what?
That's not what you want to hear.
No. Lap 7, Charles comes on and says, "How much am I losing in the straights?" His engineer says, quite a bit, to which Charles responds, "I do not want this answer. When I'm asking, please tell me." And they're like, half a second.
It sounded more like Carlos.
Yeah. Look, I don't have a Monegasque accent ready to go. Lap 30, Charles Leclerc, who's out on the slicks because he pit for slicks on 29, did like a 25-second pit stop. He goes, yeah, we've got the rain. And this guy goes, keep it on the track for 2 laps and then we'll be fast.
He does like 1 lap, loses
all the control.
No, not only did he lose all the control, he lost like, what was it, 60 seconds or something ridiculous.
Well, because his pit stop was 24 seconds stationary.
Not even just that, but yes.
And then he lost time coming out because he had to like baby it through the turns.
Through every single turn. Then moves and goes on to inters anyway.
Lap 50, Max Verstappen comes on. Keep in mind, this is still a wet track. Max Verstappen, hey, I can't touch any curbs. It almost knocks me out. Hey, Max, how about you not run over curbs when it's wet?
How about you keep it on the track?
Lap 60, this was another McLaren thing, and maybe you can touch on this. Oscar Piastri is given the green light to battle with Lando Norris if he thinks he can battle with Verstappen, to which he says, "No, I'm good here fighting Lewis and George."
Yeah, he's got George Russell behind him, and he's like, I'm kind of in the middle of a fight right now. I'm trying to keep George behind me. Yeah. And then that's right before George shoves him off. And
so I guess his team McLaren didn't really know who had better pace at that point.
Right.
And so they were asking.
Well, they saw that Lando wasn't able to match.
Right.
Because Max got a heck of a getaway.
Yep. But they gave Piastri the green light. He didn't take it, which I guess is it's either a dumb move or a really smart move. It's one of the two.
Check.
And then the last thing, we always love hearing this. They just come on the radio to Daniel Ricciardo on lap 65 with 5 laps left, and they go, "You are allowed to fight Yuki?"
Which I loved.
Every guy on the team wants to hear that. Like I don't know if he asked, I don't know if he prompted that, but just to hear your engineer come on and be like, "Hey, get after it."
Which Yuki was busy fighting the grass, but
Hey, it works out. So yeah, a couple big storylines this weekend. You had the double points for Aston, double points for Alpine, and
Mercedes, both in the top 5.
Everything about this week was different. Even Max winning was a little bit different than we've seen recently with Charles and Lando getting wins. So, all right, we'll wrap this up.
I want to say one more thing. My prediction was Lando, Max, Piastri, with Logan Sargent DNFing. And at one point in this race, Lando was leading, Max was in second, George was in third, and Piastri was in fourth, and Logan Sargent had just crashed. All I needed was for Piastri to pass George and for the race to stop right there.
You're like a guy betting parlays in Vegas. I just need these 8 things to happen in this very specific order.
All I needed was one thing. I just needed Piastri to pass George and for that to hold. I guess that's 2 things.
I think I had Max, Norris, and Leclerc.
You did.
But I also had Esteban Ocon DNFing, and he did not. So he actually got points for the first time. So I think that kind of ruins it, even though I got the first 2 right. Okay, let us know in the comments. Was Canada your 2024 race of the year? Calling it now.
Guys, if you think that Leclerc didn't get those engine problems, that he would have won the race, I don't agree with you. But it's a good bet.
All right, we'll see you.
Bye, guys.